Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the latest in the series of webinars that onesearch.direct and CLS are running. And as you can see from the opening screen, today we're talking about Japanese knotweed and property purchases. My thanks, as always, to the team at onesearch.direct for promoting this webinar. It's very much appreciated. And it's very much a timely topic. Japanese knotweed as an issue in property purchases has been around for some time. We had relatively recently an update to the guidance associated with the TA6 form, which of course you'll see on a day-to-day basis given your profession. And then most recently we had an update from the RICS on their guidance to their members, their surveying membership, as to how the issue of knotweed should be dealt with from a surveying perspective. And obviously we remain to watch and see whether or not their guidance then leads to a change in the way that the legal community and indeed, of course, the lending community view knotweed as an issue in property purchases. So I'm Steve Johnson, Business Development Director at CLS Property Insight, and I'll be your host for today. So first part of our agenda, we're going to have three sections to the presentation. The first one really evolves around the knotweed itself. So actually, what is Japanese knotweed? How might one identify it? What are the possible impacts of knotweed and implications and responsibilities resulting from the presence of knotweed, either on a property that maybe you have responsibility for or within a property which you neighbour. We'll then look, as I mentioned right at the start, at the latest RICS position when it comes to knotweed, some interesting developments in the surveying community there, which are certainly worth being aware of when it comes to the day-to-day work you carry out. But of course, we'll spend a bit more time on the Law Society TA6 property information form, really getting in under the hood of what are the options for a seller when completing that form, what are the implications for the answers that they might present, and then obviously on the buyer side, what are the implications for buyers and their legal representatives depending on the type of answers that are coming through the TA6. Again, there's a very navigable route here, but it's just worth highlighting the implications of those different answers for both sides of the transaction. And then we'll look also at the Japanese knotweed insurance policy that CLS produce. And then we'll look finally in section 3 at outcomes to consider and any questions that you might have. So just to say, there's obviously a chat box available to you within the webinar kit that we're using. Any questions that you have, please do fill those out, and I'll do my very best to answer those when we get towards the end of the day. So we start then with what is Japanese knotweed? Well, we start with a history lesson. The Victorian era was a time of excitement and exploration with the Industrial Revolution in full swing. Many things that we still use today were born of that era. They brought us, for example, the bicycle, the electric kettle, photography, the electric light bulb, all things we're very grateful for. But unfortunately, the Victorians also brought us Fallopian japonica, a beautiful decorative garden plant that was also edible, could be harvested for cattle feed. Little did they know at the time that what they brought into the UK would later on become one of the most destructive invasive species in history, causing millions of pounds worth of blight to the UK property industry. Now, when things go wrong, it's always good to have someone to blame. And in this particular instance, may I introduce Philip Franz Balthasar von Siebold. And what a splendid name that is. But nonetheless, it was unfortunately Mr. von Siebold, who was a pioneering German botanist who spent most of his working life studying Japanese flora and fauna. He achieved a great many things, but it was he, ladies and gentlemen, who introduced Japanese knotweed to Europe. And it would appear that knotweed was part of a collection of live plants presented to Siebold by his Japanese hosts and transported back to Europe thereafter. Fallopian japonica was particularly well received, initially housed in an acclimatization garden in the Netherlands. The plant was a big hit and even received, I dare say we've all aspired to get this, a gold medal from the Utrecht Society of Agriculture and Horticulture. From there, the attractiveness and robust nature of the plant led to popularity across Europe, and such was the Victorians' love and fascination with the plant that it actually featured not only in the Edinburgh Royal Botanical Gardens, but was frequently the subject of artist drawings and paintings, an example there on screen. But unfortunately, it was only once the plant was established in the UK that its destructive nature was realized. So what then is Japanese knotweed? Well, it's a fast-growing plant native to East Asia. Japan is in fact one of the few countries for whom Japanese knotweed poses no problem. And that's because being originating from Japan, it competes with a variety of comparable plants, as well as being vulnerable to local pests, diseases, fungi, and invertebrates. And in fact, in some regions, it's actually seen as a positive, as it's a pioneer species and able to establish itself on lava left by volcanic eruption, which subsequently leads on to secondary foliation and the regeneration of areas that have been lost previously to lava. Now, as you know, the UK, we're not overburdened with volcanoes, and also those other environmental balancing factors are not present. And this means that unfortunately the plant can outcompete other plants very successfully and quickly by having a continuously growing root system called rhizomes, which seek out nutrients and steal them from living plants nearby. And keep your ears out for that terminology, rhizomes. They are really at the center of why this plant is so easy to spread, so difficult to remove. We will come back to that a little bit later on. During the spring and summer period, the plant grows rapidly, generally up to 10 centimeters a day, and produces growths once the plant is mature of 2 to 3 meters. But one of the things that can make it very difficult to identify is the fact that throughout the year, it takes on very different appearances and even mimics being dead in the winter. Now, those of you who are keen gardeners may already know this, but those of you who haven't come across knotweed, either in a personal or professional capacity, might like to just take advantage of the next slide or so to get an understanding of how to identify Japanese knotweed. And as you can see from the slide there, depending on the time of the year, the plant looks quite different. It takes on different forms and appearances throughout the annual cycle, and this can make identifying it quite difficult, as it's easily mistaken for other plants, most notably bindweed, something we all have in our gardens. The photograph on the far left shows the knotweed shoot bursting through a tarmac driveway in early spring. Now, in spring, the Japanese knotweed buds resemble small, bright red buds, a little bit like asparagus looking to some extent, and the shoots will take this form of these reddish purple shoots sprouting out from the ground. And actually, at this stage in their life cycle, they can be eaten. In fact, in Japan, they are known as sansai, which is a word meaning mountain vegetable. So they are edible at this stage if you're unlucky enough to find them growing in your garden. However, once we've moved through spring, we get into the main part of the mature part of the growth season, whereby the Japanese knotweed stems will grow up to about 3 meters in height, up to 3 meters no more. And at this stage, they're often mistaken for bamboo, as the height and color of the shoots can be similar in appearance. And in summer, the leafy vegetation that forms over the plants, those big green heart-shaped leaves you can see. And in addition, the knotweed can develop small creamy white flowers that cluster together on the vines. Now, it's worth saying here that the flowers and whatever's contained within them has no capability to spread the plant. So the plant doesn't flower and propagate seeds out. Sole means of spreading the plant is through the underground root system and fractions of that, or sections of that root being spread. So if you do see the overground growth, don't panic that they have a role in spreading the plant. They don't, they are merely for display purposes. Now, when we get into the autumn and the winter, the plant's foliage does die back, and it leaves these dead brown brittle canes you can see on the right hand side, which over time will break down. And then when you get into spring the next year, the growth pattern starts again. Fresh red sprouts will appear, and then off we go towards that summer maturity. Now, there's a reason why OneSearch are running this webinar at this time of the year. Where are we? Just about the end of March, and because this is the start of the growing season. So the keen gardeners amongst you, keep an eye out around now, because if you've got knotweed, it's going to be sometime in the next sort of 2 to 4 weeks, if not already, that those buds start to make themselves known. Now, in their search for moisture, the Japanese knotweed roots can interfere with drainage structures and other pipes. And because the damage caused by the plant is quite visible, it does make for sort of quite good news headlines. You'll see that in a later slide. Fundamentally, knotweed seeks, like any other plant really, exploit existing weaknesses in properties' underground services. So whether it's cracks in concrete, whether it's bursting out in the garden, or whether it's exploiting the worst case scenario, and I hasten to say by no means typical, but the worst case scenario will be that it could potentially find its way through weaknesses in buildings, be they the mortar between bricks, whatever it might be, and sort of force its way in. Now, I hasten to say that is the worst case scenario, and the slight downgrading of concern associated with Japanese knotweed and the realization, the recognition that it's an amenity issue in many parts of the open land on a property, but that doesn't necessarily mean it automatically becomes a risk to the built part of a property. That is recognized within the new RICS guidance, but that's not to underplay the fact that it can and does spread, and if it spots a weakness, as you can see in the bottom right photo, it will exploit that in a way that other plants don't have the physical capability to do so. Now, as I say, because knotweed can be quite a topical and well-known issue, well-publicised issue, it does find its way into the media from time to time. And you may well have seen in your local media stories about properties that have Japanese knotweed concern, particularly where they impact on the amenity or value or enjoyment of neighbouring properties. Now, the article on the left-hand side is quite an interesting one, because this relates to an action taken by Bristol City Council, acting on behalf of the owners of 7 properties that neighboured a property that was infested with Japanese knotweed. Now, the property that had the infestation was owned by MB Estates, and they were repeatedly asked by the council, with gradually increasing degrees of formality, to act on the infestation. And having not done so, they were then prosecuted and ultimately fined £18,000 by the local authority. And the local authority actually prosecuted them under ASBO legislation. It was the first time that Japanese knotweed issues were prosecuted under ASBO legislation. And we'll move on to the forms of legislation that cover knotweed, including the ASBO side of things, in a slide or two's time. But I find this quite an interesting piece, because what it sets up, of course, is that if you are a landlord and knotweed is found on your property and is found in a way that is causing issues for neighbouring properties, either through loss of value or let alone property damage, you are responsible for cleaning up and remediating that knotweed. And if you choose not to, as MB Estates chose not to, you can be prosecuted now under ASBO legislation. And of course, I cast my mind back to when I was a student renting a property, and of course, did I go out into the back garden and check on a regular basis for Japanese knotweed? Absolutely not. And I suspect that may well be the case for a proportion of rental properties. So the result of that might be that actually the growth of the knotweed can get to be quite significant before there's a realization on the part of the landlord that they have an environmental problem on their land. Now, I do hasten to add that it is not illegal to have knotweed on your property. You can absolutely have it on your property. You do not have to treat it. However, the problems start when it can be demonstrated that the propagation of knotweed on your property is having an effect on the neighbouring property, either an effect by impact of loss of value, or actually the knotweed is spreading in a way and starting to sort of propagate into the neighbour's garden, for example. Now, the second image you can see there, is unfortunately an individual, and again, it shows you the degree to which knotweed can spread. An individual who's unfortunately next to Japanese knotweed, and it's run thoroughly wild in the next door garden, and that is having an impact on her ability to sell the property. Naturally, because mortgage lenders would be highly concerned about the proximity of such a density of knotweed next to a property on which they were planning on lending, or may well have lent. Now, I've mentioned the ASBO legislation. There are 3 acts, in fact, which are the main forms of control of the spread of Japanese knotweed. And as I mentioned, there is no statutory requirement to tree, remove or treat knotweed. But it is the owner's responsibility to ensure that knotweed does not spread. Now, if we start first on the left-hand side with the Wildlife and Countryside Act of 1981, this sets out specific guidance for the spread of non-native species that have caused or have the potential to cause serious problems within the UK, its environments and infrastructure. Under that Act, it's an offence to cause Japanese knotweed to grow in the wild under the provisions made in Schedule 9 of the Act. So on no account, if you have knotweed in your property, do you dig it up and quietly pop the soil out into a public space. You would absolutely be falling foul of the Wildlife and Countryside Act. Section 14.2 of the Act states that if any person plants or otherwise causes to grow in the wild any plant which is included in Part 2 of Schedule 9, which knotweed is, he or she shall be guilty of an offence. And anyone convicted of an offence under Section 14 of the WCA 81, they face a fine of £5,000 and or 6 months imprisonment. And of course, Japanese knotweed, along with a few other plants, several other plants, is listed in Part 2 of that Schedule 9. Both the Wildlife and Countryside Act of 81 and the Environmental Protection Act of 1990 control the disposal of Japanese knotweed. Now, the EPA stipulates that Japanese knotweed can only be disposed of at landfills that are licensed to handle contaminated soil. Now, the individual or organisation that has collected the knotweed is responsible for identifying a licensed landfill and transporting the knotweed to the licensed handler. Untreated knotweed is not regarded as hazardous waste under the hazardous waste regulations of 2005, but material containing knotweed that has been treated with certain herbicides could be. And we mentioned already MB Estates being the first company to fall foul of prosecution for Japanese knotweed or lack of Japanese knotweed treatment under ASBOs. Well, of course, ASBOs were introduced into the fight against Japanese knotweed as part of a reform of the Anti-Social Behaviour Crime and Policing Act of 2014. The reform now allows for ASBOs to be issued against individuals and businesses that don't control Japanese knotweed when they could reasonably be expected to do so. So it's no longer just about teens on scooters. If you're letting your Japanese knotweed propagate and interfere with others, then you may well get a knock on the door and ASBO legislation being waved under your nose. And as I say, it was under this legislation that MB Estates were prosecuted after several attempts to get voluntary action. And there have been subsequent prosecutions of landowners where knotweed has impacted on a neighbouring property. So it is an interesting line of thought for people that are buy-to-let landlords, is the degree to which they anticipate or seek to think about whether knotweed is on their properties, and if it is, particularly if you have a large property portfolio, to what degree might it be impacting on the neighbours. As I say, as with so many things, the best time to treat knotweed is when it's in a small infestation. When it gets to be more substantial, that's when the costs and implications of treatment go up quite significantly. Now, I just put this slide up. A little bit Janet and John from the graphics. You can see it doesn't really look like a property, but it's really put up just to explain perhaps how Japanese knotweed's sort of sphere of influence can extend throughout a property. If you have your nice rectangular garden here with your equally nice rectangular house in the middle, and you have somewhere in the garden a growth of knotweed, it may not be a particularly significant growth, but it's a growth nonetheless. Then potentially underneath that growth, you have a spread of roots that can expand up to 7 meters from the original plant. And of course, what you can see here demonstrated is the potential for those roots to extend under the physical building on a property, or indeed into a neighbour's garden. Now, there is, and this is reflected in the RACS position, there is debate as to actually how extensive that root network might extend. Is it 7 meters? Or is it something, could it reasonably thought to be something sort of slightly smaller in radius? But the reason we focus on 7 meters is because this has previously been sort of the benchmark, if you like, for surveyors when considering the issue of Japanese knotweed. What we'll sort of see as we get into the next slide is that there has been a distinction in the way, a change in the way that the RACS consider the issue of Japanese knotweed. And its update was updated in February 22 and actually became live in RACS guidance on the 23rd of March this year. So what's that, 5 or 6 days ago? So whereas it was previously thought that when carrying out a valuation survey, that if knotweed was present on the property or nearby, that there would be an assumption towards the diminution in property value actually being potentially quite significant. Figures of up to 10% have been mooted. And that's very much on the assumption that the impact of the knotweed may not just be on the amenity areas of the property, but actually on the physical parts of the property as well, the bricks and mortar within which we live. Now there is much more condition that permits the surveyor to think about the diminution in property value may only be a reflection of the remediation cost. Now, that's not to underplay. The remediation cost, depending on the size of the growth, may be reasonably significant, and probably as a minimum are going to be sort of £3,000 or £4,000, £2,000 or £3,000. But nonetheless, that is less than a default position of the property, the overall property value having anywhere up to a 10% impact, simply caused by the presence of knotweed on the property or nearby it. Now, furthermore, now when carrying out valuation inspections, surveyors now are only expected to identify the plant if clearly visible. Now, this is, I think, welcomed by surveyors, not least because, as we've mentioned in the earlier slides, the plant looks quite different at different times of the year. And if the dead canes are cleared, it's actually completely invisible over the course of the sort of late autumn and winter season. Not only that, of course, because the plant actually has two elements to it. It has the overground growth and, of course, the underground growth of the rhizomes, the root system. And surveyors are no longer expected to think about conceptually the root system, other than maybe we'll cut to that when we get down to the second bullet point from the bottom. So it is about what can they see on the day that they visit, and that's further measured by the fact that they're not expected to carry out a plant-by-plant check. So a surveyor is not going to be acting on behalf of a lender, is not going to be going sort of rooting through the bushes just to check if there's a small growth, introductory growth of Japanese knotweed. Now, I've mentioned already, we get down to the third from bottom bullet, the impact of knotweed to amenity spaces considered. So there is now the ability to, even if you find knotweed on the property, in their valuation, the surveyor can now take account of the fact that it is predominantly an amenity space as opposed to highly proximate to the actual building of the property. And then off-site, and this is quite a critical change as well, surveyors have always been required to consider whether or not there is knotweed close to the property. And close to has actually been 7 meters, 21, 22 feet, so quite some distance actually. And there's a recognition now that actually their consideration of knotweed only need be from 3 meters from the property, up to 3 meters from the property, has to be clearly visible, as noted in the second bullet point. And also there's a reiteration that the surveyor's assessment of the potential for off-site knotweed has to take account of the fact that they can only do that by viewing potentially over the fence of the property, for example, or they have to take advantage of public areas that surround the property. What they can't do and shouldn't be expected to do, and this guidance doesn't expect them to do, is to actually trespass on neighbouring properties in order to ascertain whether knotweed happens to be located within 3 meters of the boundary of the property they are valuing. So as a result of that, what they're able to do really to a much greater degree than the previous position is to tailor their advice to the lenders genuinely based on the severity of the impact that they can see. But if the plant is not clearly visible, if it's been chopped away, or if it's hidden by other plants that the surveyor doesn't look into, they can reasonably now be expected to report back to the lender that to their best of their abilities, knotweed is not known to impact the property or to be present nearby. Now, what we haven't yet seen is whether that change of position has a resulting knock-on effect into the lender's expectations when it comes to conveyances and how you deal with the issue. Right now, the TA6 form and the guidance associated with it remains unchanged. So what we're going to do over the next few slides now is just have a look at the TA6 form. Forgive me, I know it's a document you have spent a huge amount of time exposed to, but just to explore what the answers to question 7.8, is the property affected by Japanese knotweed, what those answers actually mean for both sides of the transaction. Well, since 2013, the seller is required to state whether Japanese knotweed is present on their property through the TA6 form. The form has been revised and further guidance was added in February 2020 with the release of the 4th edition. And you can see there that when a seller completes the form, they have 3 possible answers: yes, no, or not known. So if we take yes first, let's say a seller says yes. Well, what might that mean? It could mean that yes, knotweed is present on the sale property. It could mean that yes, knotweed has been present, but has either undergone or is undergoing a treatment plan. And if it's the latter, the plan could be in the treatment and monitoring phase, which is typically the first 3 to 5 years, or it could be in the post-treatment 10-year period, where typically an insurance-backed guarantee is in place to cover the possibility of a re-emergence of that knotweed after the first treatment phase. Just to say, the reason I mentioned 3 to 5 years in that first treatment phase is typically treatments where there is a spray treatment of some sort, a herbicide treatment. We'll have 3 years of spraying followed by 2 years of monitoring, and obviously a renewal of spraying if knotweed re-emerges. So typically you're looking at a 5-year treatment plan followed by a period where the property is covered by an insurance policy that would guarantee an insurance policy that would be instigated if knotweed re-emerged at some point, subject to conditions. Now, if the seller answers yes, they are then required to complete the second part of the question that you can see on screen, notifying the presence of a treatment plan or insurance-backed guarantee, and really the sort of the state of play. Now you start very much into then what a buyer or indeed a lender is prepared to accept. For example, if the knotweed is on the neighbouring property and is in the process of being treated, what does that mean for the buyer of the neighbouring property or indeed their lender? Very much case by case. We've seen instances where a lender is willing to lend because of the evidence of a treatment plan with an insurance-backed guarantee, but the buyer themselves chooses to pull out. And again, that choice to pull out might be based on some of the most sort of emotive cases they've seen relating to Japanese knotweed. And it may take a little while to filter in the slightly more measured approach. Now, the RICS have in association with Japanese knotweed. While it's, it is not something you choose to put on your garden, it is something that can be treated and dealt with. And perhaps if you weigh up property with Japanese knotweed versus no property or not getting a property in an ever escalating property market, maybe the pendulum is swinging back towards a degree of acceptance of the plant. But let's turn our attention now to know or not know. Now, the guidance to sellers now is that if they are unsure whether Japanese knotweed exists either above or below ground, or whether it has previously been managed on the property that they are selling, they should answer not known. And the key here is just how difficult it is for homeowners to be certain that Japanese knotweed does not exist in the terms required by the form. As a home seller, can you be 100% sure that knotweed has never existed on the property and is in no way proximate to the property that you happen to be selling? Bearing in mind, of course, we're not just dealing with the overground plant, we're dealing with the presence of a root system. And the reality is virtually no regular home sellers are going to be in a position to give a definitive answer. We are 100% sure that Japanese knotweed is not present and has never been present on this property. Frankly, it's a brave seller that answers no. The majority of sellers these days would be answering not no, because to be certain and therefore to choose no as the answer, the seller must be certain that there is absolutely no knotweed present both underground and overground. And bear in mind, as I say, that growing cycle, the dormancy, the depth of the roots, and as if that's not difficult enough, the guidance in the TA6 form goes further, asking the seller to confirm that the plant does not exist within 3 meters of the property boundary. So now reflecting the RICS guidance reflecting that same distance, even if there are no visible signs above ground. So in order to confidently answer no, the seller must be certain that no overground plant or underground root system exists within 3 meters of the property. So just stop for a minute and picture what 3 meters, 10 feet looks like from the boundary of your property. How far does that extend into the neighbouring areas that you border? Would you be confident to answer no? I certainly wouldn't be. So I think, as I say, what we find is that the majority of sellers now answer not no. And what we will come back to is the implications of not known for the buyer. Now, it's worth saying, of course, that if you do have Japanese knotweed on your property, it is a treatable concern. And prior to February 2020, the TA6 form talked about eradication of Japanese knotweed. And there's a recognition that because of the period of time that the root system can lay dormant, it's actually very difficult to eradicate. So the phraseology now has morphed into mitigation, which is why you see on the top of the slide mitigation measures. Now, there are three different ways in which Japanese knotweed can typically be treated. And by far the most quickest, but also the costliest way of removing Japanese knotweed is to excavate the plant. And in doing so, excavate all of its root system, and then you take away the contaminated soil and take it to a licensed landfill site. Now, the process in a relatively small residential infestation would typically take 1 to 2 weeks, and thereafter the hole in the ground is filled in and typical landscaping works can commence. But part of the thing that contributes towards the comparatively high cost is that quite often the soil that's taken out needs to be sifted and inspected by hand. As I say, it's quite a labour-intensive process. So it's far more common on residential properties. They'll be treated by one of the following two methods. Either foliar spray is used, and this is where herbicides are applied to the top and underside of the leaf, and this is absorbed, carried into the plant, and repeat applications of the herbicide cause the plant to become stunted, reducing its capacity to photosynthesize, and therefore regenerate. And over the course of 3 years, the plant should typically die back. Stem injection, again, is based on the use of herbicide, but it's where smaller concentrations of Japanese knotweed are often found, and it involves injecting that dose of the herbicide directly into the stems of the plants. The benefit of this is that it can be done in all weathers. Obviously, with foliar spray, you don't want the rain washing the spray off of the leaves before it's had a chance to influence the plant. And also, it's very effective in reducing the impact of potentially damaging non-target plants through a slightly indiscriminate use of a spray. Now, both of these treatments are far cheaper than excavation, but they take place over that longer time frame. An average residential outbreak might cost somewhere between £3,000 to £5,000 over a 5-year period, which, as I mentioned earlier, usually consists of 3 years of treatment, followed by 2 years of monitoring. Now, this is where, depending on the methodology that your mitigation company, your environmental company that you engage, deploy, but also their terms and conditions, then start to sort of limit or influence what you can do on the land while treatment is taking place. Because it might be that during treatment, the treated area must remain undisturbed. So you can mow the lawn, but you can't carry out any landscaping work or planting of vegetables or whatever it might be. It might disturb the soil and trigger the dormant rhizomes, the dormant root system, to start growing again. Now, it's worth also noting, as far as payment goes, that most treatment companies accept staged payment, except when the property is up for sale. Now, in those instances, they generally ask for payment for the entire project cost up front. And of course, because the vast majority of lenders will not lend without a treatment plan being in place, it really means the seller has no choice. So my advice to anyone that does have knotweed on their property is, particularly if you're anticipating sort of selling it at some point in the next 3 to 5 years, is treat it now so you can stagger the payments and potentially operate at a slightly cheaper rate, rather than being hit by a significant cost right at the point when you're looking to sell the property. It's also always worth looking, as a person triggering these environmental companies to come and work with you, is to always look at the conditions associated with the 10-year insurance-backed guarantee. Some of the insurance policies will start once the treatment phase is complete. Others will actually apply on the day that treatment starts. Some of the policies will allow you to actually, once the treatment is completed, treat your garden as normal, dig it, disturb it, whatever you want to do with it. Others will have a condition that means that for the lifetime of that insurance-backed guarantee, as I say, 10 years, the policy can be invalidated by disturbing the ground. Are you doing anything more than mowing the lawn, for example? So it's always worth looking at the conditions of those policies to make sure that, as a homeowner or ultimately potentially a home seller, the conditions of the policies meet the way you would like your garden. Now, as you can see on screen, CLS does have a Japanese knotweed insurance policy. So for those of you that are representing clients on the buyer side who are presented with a not known answer to the TA6 form, those buyers can now mitigate their potential exposure to knotweed because, of course, in declaring not known, the seller has put the onus for knotweed responsibility onto the prospective buyer. The policy has a limit of £20,000 and acts for up to 5 years after the inception date, typically around the point when the new buyer takes ownership of the property. We do have both a residential and a commercial insurance policy, again for commercial insurance for properties not exceeding half an acre. Anything above that becomes a bespoke policy, which we're only too happy to work with you on. And you can see the nature of the premiums up on screen there. But the £20,000 cost or value, should it be invoked, generally provides cover for costs and expenses that will arise as a result of the insured party getting a remediation notice, or the completion of required remediation works that were identified in a Japanese knotweed survey. So if someone moves into the property and at a later point within that 5-year period finds there is knotweed on it, they can then invoke this policy up to £20,000 for the remediation work be required, or mitigation work that would be required to deal with the knotweed. And that would include, for example, the cost of altering, repairing, or demolishing part of the property as a result of damage caused by knotweed. Obviously, that sounds quite dramatic, but that might also apply not just to the worst case scenario, i.e. the building within which they reside, but also maybe outbuildings or gardens or sheds or concrete bases that have been put down within the gardens, or brickwork or decking, for example. In addition, the policy will also cover the cost of any settlement made out of court with the prior written consent of the insurer with another party. That might include a neighbour, for example, whose property is felt to be impacted by the Japanese knotweed. So I hope that is a useful reference point. I can actually just go a useful reference point for you for those clients who wish to cover their exposure to Japanese knotweed. As I say, that policy is available through the team at onesearch.direct who market CLS policies and make them available on their website. So maybe just some points for you to consider as a takeaway. Does the seller understand the implications of know or not known when they complete the TA6 form, question 7.8, relating to Japanese knotweed? If they're answering no, do they understand that they're taking an affirmative position and could find themselves having legal action against them in the event that a buyer subsequently discovers knotweed on the property? It might sound harsh, but the fact is the majority of sellers are not horticultural experts and may not know that knotweed is on their property. Not known is really the position the seller should take. And from a buyer's perspective, do they understand that not known places the onus for Japanese knotweed responsibility onto them? Do they understand that it's where it's then to be found, it's on their shoulders rather than the person that they bought the property from? But also, do they understand that if a seller says no on the form, do they recognise that that seller may still be pretty uninformed about Japanese knotweed issues and just be trying to do the right thing? No, I don't think it's on the property. Inadvertently taking a statement that is bolder, perhaps, or position that's bolder than they should. And I think as conveyancers, are you advising your sellers about the implications of their answers, sellers and buyers, about the implications of the answers that are filled out on the TA6 form relating to Japanese knotweed? Now, just in case it's useful, you'll see on the right-hand side of the screen, I've popped up some suggested letter text, which can go into letters to buyers in the event that a seller has declared not known on the TA6 form, which of course is the majority of answers that we see now to 7.8. So OneSearch will be distributing the slide deck after the presentation, and it will include the PDF of what you see on screen. So if you think that wording would be a useful inclusion within your client letters as a way of explaining to your buyers the implications of the seller's not known answer, then you're very welcome to use that text or to amend and adapt for your own purposes. But as I say, that will be shared not long after this presentation. And I just really, again, just to maybe sort of throw some questions out to yourself. Obviously, conveyancers versus knotweed, it is a niche issue. I very much doubt when you went through law school that first and foremost on your mind was the issue of Japanese knotweed. But nonetheless, it is something that can create an exposure for a firm or indeed for a buyer or seller. So maybe some points to think about is the degree to which within your firms you either act independently as conveyancers or agree a policy with regard to how you communicate the guidance on the TA6 form and Japanese knotweed. Do you use common text in your letters to buyers and sellers? Obviously, that text I mentioned on the previous slide is available. And do you commonly recommend the insurance or other methods of mitigating risk? Once again, to what degree is this something that as individual conveyancers you plow your own furrow, or do you act as a consistently across your practice? I've been doing CPDs and training sessions on environmental issues for quite some time. I used to spend a lot of time talking about contaminated land and flood risk when they first became prominent within the conveyancing space. And generally speaking, as familiarity with the issues grew, and obviously particularly where you had the advent of warning cards and practice notes, it became much more common that practices would seek to be consistent on environmental issues in order to sort of not just benefit the clients you're representing, but ensure a consistency and of approach across the firm to reduce the risk of exposure. If at any point any of you who are attending this would like to have this form of session delivered specifically to your firm, maybe you have an online conveyancing team meeting these days, we'd be very happy to dial into that and present. Only too happy to offer that. So please do let myself or OneSearch know if that's something you'd like to do. But that brings us to the end of the session. We've had one question come in, which I was just going to mention, but if there are any others, please do feel free to post those now. And the question relates to the impact of Japanese knotweed if the property that's being transacted is a flat. That's a really good question, this. Clearly, if the flat is on the second, third, fourth, fifth floor, the likelihood of knotweed affecting it is slim to absolutely minimal. But where a home buyer or a flat owner might find themselves penalised is if knotweed is found to be on the grounds of the property, the freeholder or the management company representing them may well undertake to have that property, that knotweed mitigated. And they may well choose, rather than taking the slightly cheaper herbicidal routes, they may well choose to have the knotweed excavated and taken away, which, as I say, can be significantly more expensive. What then may happen is that the costs of that mitigation work, that treatment work, will then be split through management fees to all of the free leaseholders within a particular block, irrespective of whether you're on the first or the 8th floor. So no, a leaseholder may have no physical risk from Japanese knotweed, but depending on the terms of the management company they happen to be working alongside, they may have a financial exposure in the event that knotweed is found on site. But I say, if you have any other questions, do feel free to post those. But in the meantime, I just wanted to once again say thank you very much for your attendance today. Thank you very much for the team at onesearch.direct for marketing this webinar. I hope it's been useful, and we hope you can join us on the next one, whenever that may be. Thanks again for your time.